we're going to talk about sort of wood prep and some finishing, the types of finishes that are available. You heard a lot during show and tell. You heard how many different people use different finishes. So there's a big variety that you can use, and we're going to go through some of those. I gave this talk 2-3 years ago, and it seemed to be good. So we've got a lot of new members, so I thought we'd do it again. So if you have any questions, just jump in whenever you want. So what I'm going to do is sort of talk about a little bit of safety, talk about prepping your wood. That's even more important than the finishing, is to get the wood prepped correctly. I'm really more of a furniture flatwood kind of worker than turning, but I think a lot of the same principles apply. And I've finished a number of things in terms of turning pieces, so I believe a lot of this same philosophies apply to wood turning as well as woodworking. So first thing really to think about is
anybody need a single or double? Everybody got one? What do you need? A single. How many are you?
okay. When you think about safety, two most important things is dust while you're turning, obviously, and fumes while you're finishing. Somebody mentioned fumes. I think Charlie mentioned fumes earlier today. So when you think about dust collection, you really want to, the first place to start is at the source. Okay, you really want to have some type of dust collection, like we got this up here. You've got a vacuum system that's hooked to a vacuum. That's where you really want to start your dust collection. Mask, and everybody says, oh, I just wear a mask. Well, that's sort of secondary, actually. You really want to collect as much as you can before it gets to the mask. All right. So you want to install some type of dust collection especially while you're sanding. As you generate a lot, as you know, you generate a lot of dust while you're sanding. And unfortunately, we're all familiar with masks these days. So there are a variety of dust masks, cloth ones, the N95s, and this type. What's nice about this type of mask is you can collect dust with it depending on what filter you put on. You can also put a different filter on and collect fumes. So if you're going to be finishing something with aerosols, things like that, you want to try to collect those fumes. So this type of a mask allows you to do that. There's actually a version like this that's more streamlined. These filters aren't quite as big for dust collection, and this one is for fumes. So especially if you're going to do some spray finishing, you want to use a mask like this. Eye protection, obviously, when you're turning for the wood, you're worrying about chips. You're worrying about that kind of stuff. When you're turning with finishing, I'm sure you've all done it. You put some nice liquid on your piece, turn on the lathe, and there it goes up over your shoulder. So if you're wearing a mask like this, you get a nice streak up the front of your mask. I'm sure nobody's ever done that before. But one little hint is they do sell for masks like this covers for motorcycle masks, and you can get these little tape-on covers, tapes on both sides, and it will collect all those splatters. And after a while, when you can't see through it anymore, you just peel it off and put a new one in. So you can get those for motorcycles, and you can use them on these as well.
Saran wrap too.
That's a good idea. Yeah, that's a good idea too. Yeah, so you don't cook yourself. So you got dust, you got fumes, and more so maybe when you're turning, but a lot of people wear gloves. Now, I'm not a big fan of gloves like this. I wear these when I'm jointing and planing wood. I'll use these because of splinters. I don't like getting splinters, and you get that off rough wood. And when I'm maybe outside using some pressure treated wood. I'm not a big fan of gloves in the shop, except for when I'm turning. I'll wear a pair like this with the cut off fingers, like this type of glove, because on the lathe you can hold it like this, and it builds up a lot of heat, as you all know. So I'll wear a glove like this if I'm turning and it's generating a lot of heat on the lathe. So those are the sort of most important things in terms of safety. So let's move on to sort of the surface preparation. How do you get your piece ready? Yep. Okay. Same safety, right? But yes, some people like gloves, some people don't. Okay. Well, no, in terms of in general. Oh, you're talking about surgical gloves. Oh, yes. In fact, I brought some and didn't even mention it. So yes, so you have this type of glove as well. So which is just the the latex or type of glove. Okay. Now, one interesting, I don't know if you know, one interesting little tidbit is they come in black like this, and you can get them in blue, also the blue ones. Why do they make black ones? So mechanics, things like that, you'll see in an auto body shop or an auto repair shop, we wear black gloves because they show liquid a lot easier than the blue. You can really tell when these are wet, which I guess with finishing would be handy to know as well. So if you use black ones, you can see the liquid a lot easier than if you use the blue ones. Okay. So let's move into sort of surface preparation. The key thing here is, and if you read David Ellsworth's book, he really is a big proponent of you want to get a smooth surface off the tool, right? You really don't want to have to start with heavy, 80 grit, 60 grit sandpaper. You really want a sharp edge right off the tool. So one, you really need to learn how to sharpen your tools. You really want to have a sharp tool. The sharper the tool, the cleaner the cut you're going to get. If you want to learn how to sharpen, talk to Hank. What do you say? So learn how to sharpen, and if you're using carbide tools, you want to rotate the carbide tip. So here's a carbide tip on this tool. Periodically, you want to loosen it up and just rotate it. It gives you a nice fresh edge. I'm always sort of using this at the same. You come around, you're always using it at the same point on the carbide tip. So you want to rotate these periodically. And somebody mentioned some time ago that you loosen it up and just randomly spin it or randomly turn it, and eventually you'll use all the surface. Don't try to figure out, well, this is where I had it before. So rotate your carbide tips if you haven't done that. The other thing is you want to do a shear cut. And again, in Ellsworth's book, he says the shear cut allows you to start sanding with 240 grit instead of 60 grit. Okay. So if you don't know what a shear cut is, it's when you are approaching. I brought a piece of wood. Here's a piece of wood. So here's this wood on your lathe, and you're approaching it with the side of your tool at a steep angle, okay? And you should be getting very feathery type of shavings coming off of that surface. So you're using the side of the gouge here at a steep angle, and it'll give you very thin, very fine little shavings, okay? And that will give you an extremely smooth surface, shear cut. That's using a gouge like this. You can also, if you have carbide tools, so here's the carbide cutter, the round cutter. You want to hold this at an angle as well, do the same type of shear cut. On the easy tool version of this, it's basically a square shank. Right? This is Woodpecker's version of the same tool, and they've beveled the edges here. So you can actually, when you put it on the lathe like this, at beveled surface, it's at the correct angle to do the shear cut. Right? So if you're planning on getting one of these, you might look at the Woodpecker version, because it does help you in terms of positioning the tool for that shear cut. Yep.
I find a negative breaker will give you.
Yep.
Much shear cut easy. You have never tried it.
Right. There's also, I mean, yes, there's many ways to do this. Go ahead. Yep. Yep. Okay. Okay. Any questions about shear cut? Yeah. Okay. The round one? Yeah. It's really a small circular disc, basically. It's got a little angle to it as well. It's like a cup almost. Yeah. Okay, so moving on to sanding. There's some fundamental truths and myths, I believe, about sanding. So if you think about smoothness and the smoothness of a surface of a board, like this board here, smoothness is really an illusion. All right. So what it is finer and finer sanding of a surface is finer and finer scratches. Right? So as you increase your grits, you're getting finer and finer scratches. If you think about a polished piece of jewelry, under a magnification, you'll still see scratches on that surface. So it's sort of an illusion. A lot of people here probably have random orbit sanders, right, when they're doing sanding. Well, the reason they call it random orbit is that that pad is randomly moving as it's vibrating on your surface. And that randomness causes random scratches, which makes it harder for your eye to see the surface, to see the scratch pattern. You take that same grit, put it through a drum sander, which is a linear sanding process, you'll see those scratches much easier than if you did it with an orbital sander, because they're all in a straight line. So random orbit sander gives you that illusion that it's more of a smooth surface than what it might be. Okay. So sanding is really, the key to sanding is to move up through the grits. Your final sanding, so when you're sanding a board or sanding your piece on the lathe, should always be with the grain, okay? Because you want that scratch pattern, no matter how thin it is, you want that scratch pattern to be going with the grain. And it's sort of hidden, if you will, in quotes, I guess, hidden by that grain direction. So you want to do a final sanding. So whether if you're doing a flat piece, you're sanding like this, pretty much by hand. If you have a bowl on the lathe, you want to sand with the direction, whatever direction that grain is going. Okay, with your final grit. All right. I often will sand in the same direction as I move up the grits. As you know, Norm, who's on the call, and I make these handles for tools. So as I move up through a couple of grits, I will stop the lathe, sand in that direction, and then go to the next grit. It makes the process a little quicker, I believe, going from grit to grit.
How high you go? I barely on the boat.
Right.
I say, can't see it. Anyway, somebody will buy it. The thing is, I know some of the petty people go way up to the south. You know how you get
600 and 400 is 1,000.
But
Right.
what do you people, where do you quit the upper? 400, 600, what do you do?
So the ending grits really depend on a lot on what finish you're going to use. Okay. So if you're going to do like a hand rubbed oil kind of finish, you would go to a higher grit. If you're going to do a spray on, or some brush on, whatever, urethane or a polyurethane, you can go to a lower grit because it's going to fill in that little roughness anyway. So for me, I stand probably 90% of up to about 180 grit because of the finishes that I may use. But if I was going to apply like a tung oil or some other finish that gives me more of a rustic, a finish that's going to penetrate the wood, not sit on the surface of the wood, I would sand maybe to 220. I seldom go higher than 220 myself. I don't know what other people are doing. Right.
That's why the higher grits they should, because the scratch size is smaller.
They do up to, I believe, up to a point. So I would go, 120, 220, or 180, 220, but you start getting too high, you're starting to burnish the wood. Right? When you start to burnish the wood, it's not going to take the finish as well as if it was not burnished. Okay. So, so my personal feeling is that you don't have to go to, 600, 800 kind of grit. You're putting like a CA glue on a pen. Everybody says, oh, I'm going to sand these pens really to a high grit number and then put on CA finish, 10 coats of CA finish. I think you're wasting your time sanding to that higher grit.
I do my pen, wood pen, or whatever the pen is, I'm gonna put a CA glue finish. I sand 220, and once I put the CA glue and I'm finished, I'll wet sand up to 12,000.
Yes, well, that's different.
Yeah.
Right.
But that's same finish. You're right.
Right.
You get up there, I use the same to 4,000 on wood.
Right.
And I can get away with one layer of CA glue, but that doesn't make it durable.
Right. Right. But you're right. So sanding, when I sand like a finish, I will sand, or sort of jumping ahead maybe, but in between coats, I'll sand 320, 400 grit. And it doesn't matter at that point, it doesn't matter what grain direction you're sanding, because you're no longer sanding the wood, you're sanding the finish. It doesn't matter if you're going cross grain, if you will, on the finish, because you're not sanding the wood at that point. And you can wet sand or dry sand to a much higher to get a really fine, really smooth finish.
Do you do anything like the sanding tape afterwards?
We'll get to that. We'll get to that. Yeah. One of the myths here, one of the fundamental truths, dull 180 grit is not the same as 220 grit. Right? A lot of people say, oh, I'll just use older sandpaper and it sands smoother than if it was new sandpaper. No, that's not true. Sandpaper cuts as you sand. Right? Think about what sandpaper is. It's really small little like grains of sand, if you will, and the edges break off and it refreshes itself and it's cutting the wood. Whereas dull sandpaper doesn't do that, right? So what dull sandpaper does is it burnishes the wood. Okay? So if you have like 180 sandpaper, don't think that once it's all really used a lot, I'll just use it now when I go to, instead of using 220, because it's really doing two different things. You're burnishing versus cutting the wood.
Funny that you use sandpaper like somebody else is buying it.
That's right. That's right.
The one guy that uses it like sandpaper factory.
Yeah, if it's getting clogged up, There are ways to clean sandpaper. I should have brought that, you know, there, especially on a power sander. There are these little rubber bricks, if you will, that you can use that'll clean the sawdust out of the sandpaper. But if it's getting really clogged up, especially if you're sanding off an old finish, maybe to apply a new finish or something, you really want to use a lot of sandpaper. Yep. I believe the difference is the spacing of the grit particles. I think an open, now you correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sort of on the edge here. But I believe the spacing of the particles and how easy it won't clog as easily as a closed coat sandpaper. I believe that's correct. It
So we have very little use for
correct. I guess unless you're now starting to wet sand your surface.
What is the increment between the sandpaper? Let's say I start with 100.
Right.
Do I go 180 or do I
Yeah.
go 140 or 150 or
Right.
what are the steps?
So as I'll say here in a minute, so if you look at sandpaper, there are tables of, and you can go on the internet and look up sandpaper grits, and you'll see there's a sequence of grits. And depending if you're in the US or in Europe, you'll see these different codes. But basically, you do not want to skip grits. If you're going like 60, 80, 100, 120, 180, 220, 320, 400, you want to go through those grits. Okay, especially at the lower grits. Don't skip from 80 to 120. Okay, we'll get to that here in a second. So you want to go through the different grits. Okay, and really the thing is so you want to go like I'll sand 80, 120, 180, 220. I'll go through those grits. And don't be afraid of the lower grits. All right. Don't, everybody says, oh, I'm not going to start with 80 because it scratches the wood too much. When you think about what sandpaper does, right? So you want to remove the defects. If you're going to sand and there's some defects, you want to remove those defects. It's going to happen a lot quicker if you use like an 80 grit, a rougher grit. And then subsequent grits are going to remove the scratches of the previous grit. So if you take 120 or 180 and you've got a defect, it'll eventually remove it. But it's going to take a lot longer for that paper to stand off enough wood to get rid of the defect. Okay? So, and it's a lot quicker to sand with 80 and then move up through the grits, because the other grits, once the defect's gone, all they're doing is removing scratches. Right? So let's say don't be nervous about if you have to use 80 grit, go down to 80 grit and start working your way up, because you in the long run it'll be quicker to sand than if you tried starting with a higher grit sandpaper. Well, that's the other thing. I teach at Woodcraft. We use an orbital sander, and we put the sandpaper on, and everybody takes first thing they do, and I tell them, the weight of the sander is more than enough. And the first thing they do is they jam it down there and they start moving it around. Well, the harder you press, all that's going to do is create deeper scratches that you're eventually going to have to sand out. Okay, so you do not have to press hard. You press it on, you let this paper do the work, whether you're using an orbital sander or whether the lathe is on. You let the paper do the work. You don't have to press hard. All you're going to do is generate heat if you do that. And heat means you're generating friction, right? Which you don't want to do. You want to sand. You don't want to generate a lot of heat, a lot of friction that's going to scratch and burn your wood. Right? So you don't have to press hard when you use these grits. So, and you want to work your way up through the grits. Okay. Let's see.
You can skip some of it.
Yeah.
Just sound like the beat
Yeah.
you do, because you said,
Right.
I don't get lower, go to 80, 100. Then go to 180.
Right. So I guess I skipped 150. I guess there is a 150. Then I'll get to 180, 220, 320. I don't think there's any in between those. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I think somewhere,
Yeah. Now,
I don't know if that was, cutting to divided another number, so if you are 150, so the rest of it can be 150. And then 150 divided by 2 is 75. So 150 plus 225, so it was what?
yeah.
So
Well, I mean, if you look at the I'm not sure what your question is, but I mean, if you look at the American list of sandpapers, the P, like P220, P150, whatever. I mean, I stick with the major ones, which are 60, 80, 120, it is 150, 180, 220, 320. Yeah. Let's see here. Where am I? Okay, sanding out a defect. So say you have a little dip in the side of your piece. Don't sand that dip, right? You want to sand around the defect. You want to take the surrounding surface and bring it down to the level of your defect. All right. So most people, if this is spinning on the lathe, and here's my defect, they'll stand like this. Well, you want to sort of sand around the defect in order to bring down the surface around the defect, then blend it all together, right? Because if you just sand the defect, it's just going to get deeper and deeper. So you want to sand around it and then blend your surface together. All right. Okay. And you can actually sand too much. Finer and finer grits will start to burnish the wood and prevent the wood from absorbing the coloring, the stain or dye or the top coat. It's true except for end grain. Okay, so if you have a piece, let me talk about flat wood first. So if you have a piece of wood, I'll sand it, like I mentioned, like to 180 or to maybe 220, but typically 180. And I'll sand the end grain to 600. Right? And I do that because the end grain, think of it as this board is a bunch of straws. Okay, this end grain, because of the capillary tubes here, I mean, the end grain is going to suck up that liquid a lot quicker, a lot faster than the long grain direction. So I will sand the end grain to like 600 to burnish the edge. And that way it slows down and prevents some of that absorption on the end grain. And that'll equalize the color of the finish or of the coloring, let's say a dye or that you're putting on here, in order that the edge of the table, for example, doesn't look a whole lot darker than the top. Right? Same is true on your bowls and stuff. You may see that bowl, which is an end, which if you mount it like this, you've got two sides that are of your bowl that are end grain, right? You may notice that edge is darker sometimes than the long grain side of your bowl. So you may want to try to sand that with a higher grit, but especially by hand, if you will. In order to burnish it a little to equalize the coloring, if you're putting coloring. So I will sand to the higher grit in that case. I do, well, mainly for dust collection. I don't. I guess unless somebody knows, I mean, I don't think the direction of your sanding makes a difference when you're going forward and backward. Well, I don't know. I mean, I mean, grain does have a direction. Okay, if you think about a cat or a dog, the fur is laying down and it's smoother to go in one direction than the other. Same thing's true with wood. Wood has fibers laying on top of each other, and it, you know, it's rougher one way than the other. So if you're hand planing, you can definitely tell which way the grain's going. Does that matter when you're sanding? No, I think when you get up to that higher grit, I gotta believe it's not making much of a difference.
You know, but, put the water on that to raise the grade and do it again.
Right.
Great water.
Well, depending on your finish, if you're going to use a water-based finish, I mean, water raises the grain of your wood. Okay, it wets the wood, the fibers stand up and they dry, and it feels rough because you've done that. If you're going to use eventually, I mean, if you're going to use a water-based finish, you should pre-wet your piece, let it dry, and then lightly sand it, the high grit. And that way you take off that fuzziness, and when you come in with a water-based dye or a water-based finish, that first coat's not going to raise the grain again. Right. We'll get to that. We'll get to that. We'll talk about finishing. Jumping ahead here. So you know, I guess I've never seen anybody write about the issue of grain reversing the way I reverse it because of my dust collector, but not so much because I'm worrying about like if I'm sanding with 220 grit or something like that, that I'm raising the grain because of the direction of the blade. Anybody had that experience? Right. I've never heard that. Interesting. I've never heard that. Right. I've not heard that. Maybe true. I don't want to say it's not true. Okay. All right. Said that. Say slow down the lathe. I mentioned heat means you're creating friction and not cutting. I said give the paper time to work. All right. Watch the dust coming off the paper. You want to see dust coming off the paper. If you're not, your paper may be clogged. You're burnishing the wood. You're no longer cutting the wood. You may need a new piece of paper. Keep it clean. I've said all that kind of stuff already. All right. So sandpaper. So as we've talked a little bit about sandpaper, you can get sandpaper like this. This is Rhino wet sandpaper. For our handles, we used to, at least I used to, I think I'm still wet sands. I don't wet sand anymore, but this is a wet, dry type of sandpaper. I really like Rhino products. If you're familiar with Rhino sandpaper products, they seem to last, 10 times longer than a regular Norton or some other type of sandpaper. So this would be just a regular sheet that you can tear up. You can get sandpaper in strips and rolls. I think Peter has this over there. Yeah. So so you can get it over here. So you can get these Klingspor is a big name for this this type of sandpaper. They sell cutoffs. So they'll get to an end of these big rolls, and then they'll sell the cutoffs. If you ever go to the Klingspor store in North Carolina, you can dig through this huge box and pull out scraps that look like this. So you can get sandpaper in rolls as well for the different grits. So I'll use this type when I'm just sanding wood. In between coats, Wayne mentioned in between coats, I'll use this type of sandpaper. It's got a foam back. Right, we'll get to that in a minute of why it's the foam on here. So when you're sanding, you just don't want to take your sandpaper, you just don't want to go like this, take a piece, fold it up like this, and start sanding. All right, because when you do it like that, you do it like that all the time, right? When you do it like that, you got your finger pressure on here, and if you have waves and dips in your wood, your hand's going to traverse those waves and dips in the wood. Okay, so you're not going to sand it flat. Right? What you want to do is have something behind this that is hard, right? That gives it a flat surface. Like, and you can, I should have brought a little sanding block, but you can get these sanding bits if you want to use like a drill or a power sander. And they have these foam, they're called interface pads. So here is a somewhere. So this is called an interface pad, and you can squeeze it. This is a soft one. Here's one that is hard.
Yes.
Right? And you want to use.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. You want to use a block or one of these types of interface pads behind your lower grit or behind your sandpaper, I shouldn't say lower, behind your sandpaper, so that that sandpaper rides on the high parts of your piece that you're sanding, which will eventually bring those down to meet the valleys. Okay. Whereas if you're just holding the sandpaper like this, that's not going to happen. Right? You're going to ride those dips and surfaces. The same as concept as using a jointer on a piece of wood to smooth the piece of wood. That's why jointer planes come in various sizes, so they ride the surface over the low spots. So you want to get something that is going to keep it firm. Okay. As you get to the higher and higher grits, that you could start to use softer and softer interface pads, because now you've got a curved vase or something, vase that you're sanding. You do now want it to start to adjust to the shape of the piece that you're working on. So you do want to use a softer interface pad. I said you can put these types of things in your drill. You can make these. You don't have to buy these. What's his name at Central Valley? Fred Williamson he's got videos out on the internet how to make these pads, these types of things for sanding. So you can put them in a drill. You can put them into a right angle drill if you're trying to get into one. You can use something like this called a friction sander. So this thing, goes on the lathe and put it against the wood, and this spins. Okay, and you can put different size heads, these different heads onto this, different pieces of sandpaper. The sandpaper, comes off, it's Velcro back, stick it on, and you can go into the interior of your bowl, the exterior of your bowl. It takes a little practice to get used to getting it at the right angle so that it's spinning and everything. But you can use sanders like this as well to do your surface. Okay, so how do you know when to switch grits? Okay, it's always an interesting question. So you want to do is take a critical look at the surface. Scratches are okay, defects are not. The scratches you're going to remove with a higher grit, defects you want to get rid of at the lower grit. Keep that in mind. So you want to you can shine a light at a steep angle and get the scratches and the defects will capture the light and or reflect, you'll see the reflection and see the shadow differences. So you can use a bright light at a steep angle. You can close your eyes and rub the surface with your fingers. Your fingers have very good sensitivity to that. There's a technique that Charles Neal brought over. He was a automobile car. He was Charles. If you don't know Charles, he was a woodworker. Used to be down in Harrisonburg area, professional 30-year woodworker. Started out as an automobile car detailer, and one of the tricks they used was something called trace coating. And what that was that they would take some paint on the surface of the car and then sand it off. And as they sanded, that paint would be in all the little scratches and all the little defects on the surface of the car, and they just sand until those disappear, and then you're done. Okay. So he used the same process in woodworking. So if you had a surface that sort of had just come off the planer, okay, and if you looked at the surface without any kind of stain on it, if you held it, you could hold it to the light, and then you would see these fine lines here, you can see here, if you got it in the right light. But if you're holding it like this, sanding, it's very hard to see these defects. Sometimes hard to see all these defects. So what he did was he took some dye. You got to use dye, not a stain. You want to use a dye, not something with a pigment in it. So he would use a dye, diluted dye, and just splash it all over the piece he was making, and then sand it off, and it would reveal all the defects. And when you sanded off away all those defects, you knew you were done with that grit, and you moved up to the next grit. Okay, so here's a board I'll pass around, and you can feel this side of the board is rough, okay, which is easy to detect. But in the middle here, this is fairly smooth because this has been sanded a little bit. It's smooth to the touch. You might say, oh, well, that's done. And then, 2 weeks later, when you start to finish your project, you start to see all these lines. Okay, so this is sanded, but not all the way. And then this is sanded down, beyond seeing the defects. So, I use this all the time when I'm doing furniture. I think it's applicable to, your sanding turnings as well. I would do it with a passive flare. You got to be careful of end grain again, right? End grain sucks up the wood. So you're doing a bowl that's a face grain bowl, so it's got end grain on the sides. I would be very careful how much dye I put on that, because it's going to suck it up much more than the other surfaces. So I would, if you're going to use it, and I've done this, I've diluted it a lot so that it's visible, but it's easy to sand off. And I'll also dilute it a lot if I'm doing a light colored wood, like tiger maple, for example, or maple, or some light colored wood, so that I don't have to worry and spend a lot of time sanding it off because of it's soaking in more than I want it to. But it's a very interesting technique, and it's really very beneficial to seeing surface defects.
When you stand side grade and grade, you can stand a lot, especially to the course of the lips. Does that create divots?
It can.
Ingrain doesn't stand nearly as quickly as side grade does.
It can. So I would, as I said, I would use a block in my sanding paper so that it's riding the surface, and it's not, you're not going to be pressing harder necessarily in one spot than the other and have a little dip.
That's great for the side contour. Round side grade ingrain. Your foot sanding is part of it. You aren't sanding.
What?
Your flat surface is closer to you on the side.
Well, that's true, although, you know, I guess, I mean, I'm not saying use a small block like this. I mean, I've used long ones, you know, so, and it is, you know, like, hand me that bowl. I mean, that's, you know, so I would use, you know, sandpaper that was sort of that long, you know, and have it spinning. And I'm moving it back and forth like this to try to, I wouldn't just hold it in one spot either. You know, so, so I think that's, I mean, that's how I would say it.
Technique I use is just dye.
Yes, but the same concept. You're putting something on the surface to do that. I've used food coloring in the past, graphite, right?
Just if I'm trying to do a higher and I finish it down, I get to a point where I don't see anything until I start building up the finish.
Right,
And then it's too late because I'm already at the diameter I need, so I can't go anymore.
right,
But yeah, that.
right. Okay. Sanding tools, I've mentioned sort of already, you know, the angled angled drills with these types of pads, a kinetic type sander. Typical type of paper, aluminum oxide sandpaper. It's an open coat sandpaper, and it fractures, meaning the grains of that same paper fracture and create new surfaces as you're sanding. So you know, I wipe the boards down in between grits. I just use a rag. I don't use a tack cloth or anything. I think tack cloth deposits just as much as it takes off. So I just use a rag and yeah. So I clean off the board in between grits, just to get rid of that. Same thing when you're sharpening. If you're sharpening with a whetstone or something, always clean the stone in between. If you're using a jig, always clean the jig and and your tool before going to the next grit, so you don't put down, you know, any like you don't put down 1,000 grit sludge on your 5,000 grit stone. Yeah. So I always clean in between grits. Yeah, yeah, but that, I think that still leaves a little dust on the surface. Okay. Yep. Yes. So Mirka, for sure, Mirka has a type of sandpaper that's really a mesh. It's not like what they use for drywall sanding. And you have some, but it's good for sanders that have a lot of holes in the sanding pad and to suction out that the grit. The idea was that it's a mesh so that it's not going to clog up. That's the theory behind it. If you're hand sanding with it, I think it clogs up just as much as regular sandpaper does because there's no vacuum to suck out the stuff in between in the mesh. But it does make a difference when you're power sanding with a vacuum. And there's these other pads I'll get to here in a minute. Okay. Oh, if I go to this sheet here, let's talk a little bit about finishes. So I talked about surface prep. So coloring. So there's two ways to color your wood. Okay, one is so there's two ways to color the wood. Basically, you can dye the wood or you can stain the wood. Most people are familiar with stains. Stains are really like a clay or a pigment that's ground up very thin, put into solution with some dryers and sealers, and that's called a stain. Right? If you open up a can of stain that has been sitting on the shelf for a while and go to stick and go to the bottom, you'll see it brings up this big sludge, which is the pigment has all settled to the bottom of the can. Right? So you stir it all up and you use it. Well, the way it colors the wood is that the pigment collects into the pores of the wood and colors the wood. There's some coloring of the background, but it's mainly coloring the pores of the wood. So open pore woods like oak, ash, really take the color really nice and really accentuates the grain of the wood. But a lot of people will get frustrated with stains because they'll go to Lowe's, they'll buy a nice beautiful piece of Baltic or of birch plywood, build their cabinets, buy a can of walnut stain, put it on, wipe it off, and all the color came off. It looks crappy. Everybody gets frustrated because their birch plywood doesn't look like walnut anymore. And that's because there's less pores and stuff to capture the color of the wood of the stain. And with stains, because there are these sealers in it and dryers in it, you put it on, wipe it off. It's sort of what you see is what you get. You put more coats of stain on, it doesn't really get much darker. It's sort of, I would say one shot, but it's what you see is sort of what you get. On the other hand, you have dyes, and dyes color the wood, and a dye can be natural coloring like tea and coffee and asphalt. The asphalt on red oak and white oak is a beautiful finish. And then there are synthetic colors as well, but they're all in solution. It's not a pigment, right? So when you put it on the wood, the wood fibers absorb that coloring and it colors the wood uniformly. So the background, the pores, everything gets colored, and the fibers of the wood dry, harden with that color. So it'll color your wood much more uniformly than a stain will. So I use dyes probably 95% of the time. They're much more flexible. You can use them straight. You can mix dyes together, color your wood, make different colors. You can layer them, put one color on your wood, let it dry, put another color on, build layers of color. So you could take a piece of maple and make it look like walnut using different colors, okay, and with dyes. So it is much more flexible. So those are the two ways to color your wood. The ones I recommend would be a company called General Finishes, which you can get at Woodcraft and Rockler stores. You can get it online. But Woodcraft, Rockler carries General Finishes. You can go to Lowe's and Home Depot and buy both products, both dyes and stains. Like Minwax, for example, makes both. But General Finishes is a professional grade finish. Right? Professional furniture companies use these products. And if you open up a can and look at the amount of pigment and the General Finishes stain, compare it to what you'll buy at Lowe's, there's a world of difference. Okay, so if you're going to spend all this time building something or turning something and you're going to stain it or dye it, go buy a good finish, some good projects.
Yeah, if we write down what kind of finish we use, part of the matter is they think that
Okay. Wow. Now you know, right? Now you know. But Armor Seal. Rubber. Yeah.
Let's talk about drying time, I know. Maybe that answer what
It will. It will. When we talk about the different types of products, we can do that. So, dyes you can get either as a water-based dye or alcohol. And you can buy little. This is a trans tint, so you can mix up your own versus buying a big can of dye. Or water-based. Water-based will raise the grain. The alcohol base, or sometimes they're called NGR, non-grain raising dyes, won't raise the grain. So you can get them either way. And I guess that brings up the point of you're seeing a trend in this finishing market of things moving towards water-based finishes. And years ago, everybody was afraid of using water-based finishes, but they weren't that good. Although latex paint, which is basically a pigmented finish, been around for many, many years. But the but these types of finishes, there's this trend towards water-based because of EPA regulations. So you're seeing a lot of the urethanes and lacquers and things like that harder and harder to find. Somebody mentioned Deft this morning. Well, they went out of business at one point, and now there's another company making the same product. But right, they're harder to find now. But
it's available. It's available on whatever that hardware store is on the person for the size of Woodstock. Def got that. They got that, but they have stack. They don't have long. Yeah, that's right.
Right. Okay, well, that's an interesting point, which I'll bring up next. What was I going to say?
I use powder dye, I can mix it through the wood water with alcohol, with the oil. I like water, it's for fiber.
Yes.
Not as fiber.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I don't know why. But dyes, that's a good point. Dyes are much more translucent than a pigment. If you really wanted a translucent type of surface look, dyes are much more translucent. Okay, what did you do? Not yet. Go ahead. That's yet. That's coming. But go ahead.
After the odor is gone, takes about a month. It's big now and can't yeah, but the major problem with any soil, Brad, don't fall it up and go to bed because it's burn out and on. What I do is I throw them out and put them outside, don't dry, don't put plants. Stop the burn down with those people.
Yeah. Right. I was going to mention that any oil, not just Danish oil, any oil-based finish, don't ball it up because when it dries, it generates heat and it can spontaneously combust. Okay. So you do have to be careful of that. Okay. Okay, so surface sheen. So before we get into well, I guess that's coming up when I polish. Okay, so that's how you color wood. You can dye it, you can stain it. Now you want to protect it. So you want some type of surface protection. Right? So there's a whole wide variety of types of finishes on the market. Okay, some of them provide good surface protection, and some don't. Some are not made to provide surface protection. So let's sort of walk through some of the different types, and I can show you some examples. So first type of finish is a penetrate, is an oil-based finish. Right? It's natural occurring finish. Things like walnut oil, tung oil. Yeah. So here's tung oil. This is one from Walrus Oil, name of the company. Danish oil is another one. Also, actually, Danish oil is actually a mix. So let's right. Teak oil, walnut oil, mineral oil, all those will give you a nice sort of rustic hand rubbed type of finish. They soak into the wood, polymerized, harden the fibers inside the wood, but they do not build a lot of surface top coat. So if you wanted a high gloss dining room table, you're not going to use walnut oil to do that, because that's not what it's made for. But if you want sort of that nice, grain, natural grain look, invisible top coat, you might use an oil-based finish. Now they do take longer to dry, right? So this says, let's see what this doesn't say. But dry 12 to 24 hours. Okay, so oil finishes are going to take longer to dry, depending on the finish. There are others. Walrus oil seems to be sort of a new up and coming kind of popular brand. They have a thing called furniture butter. Let's see this one. So there are a variety of these oil-based products. You can tell they're dry, as Stark mentioned, by smelling them. You can't smell them off-gassing anymore. They're dry. And that's really going to be true for all these finishes. And also, as Stark sort of alluded to, any of these finishes are food safe after they're cured. Right? So don't get hung up and say, "Oh, I'm making a salad bowl. I got to go out and buy salad bowl dress." Finish. Any of these finishes, once they dry, once they're cured, and you can tell they're cured by smelling them, they're not outgassing anymore, are food safe. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that you'll take a deft finish, a lacquer finish, and put it on your cutting board, right? It's not because it's not food safe. Yep. Well, what can I say? That's the truth. So you wouldn't put deft on your cutting board because it dries as a film finish, right? It's food safe, but when you start chopping your cutting board, you're going to get these little pieces of plastic, basically, right? Which you don't want in your food. You won't get that with an oil-based finish, right? So don't think it's because it's food safe. I can use anything on my cutting board. So you got to sort of think about how it's going to be used as well. Yep.
You hear about the long oil and short oil?
No, I'm not familiar with that. Okay. Never heard of it. Wiping finishes. So many years ago, there was a finish called varnish, right? Which is still available, marine varnish for your boats and stuff. Very nice varnish, very good varnish, extremely hard to use. It took a long time to dry. Use a dust-free environment, use tack cloths that wipe off, get a nice clean surface. So they sort of have this almost disappeared now. And what the manufacturers have done is they've mixed varnish-like material, varnish, urethanes, things like that, with oil. They've made what's called a wipe-on, wipe-off finish. So you can take a product like Hank mentioned Armor Seal and Sealacell. These are oil and urethane mixes. You can wipe them on, or I use a foam brush Depends if it's a horizontal or vertical surface, but you basically can wipe it on, let it sit there for a while and then wipe it off. Wipe it off so that it's not going to drip, but you know, if you rub your finger, you would get a little coating on your finger. So that would dry, and they're very easy to use. They build, depending on here, I'll mention here in a second, they build more of a surface protection because it has a urethane in them. So the oil part soaks in and sort of enhances the grain. And then the urethane part builds your top coat. Now, what you don't know is what's the ratio of oil to urethane. So if you take these two, both from General Finishes, one's called Seal, one's called Armor Seal. Seal has more oil than urethane. So this is a lot like Danish oil. It soaks in, you know, enhances the grain and builds a little bit of a top coat, not much. Okay. Whereas Armor Seal, same chemicals, but different proportion. This has much more urethane than oil. So this will build your top coat. So I'll use like one coat of this followed by 2-3 coats of this. And this is a very tough, very durable top coat. Very, very durable. We've got a vanity in our bathroom that I made probably 10 years ago now. It's got this on it. We've got 7 cats and water and everything on that daily, and it still looks great. I know what I mentioned satin. So these products do come in different sheens: satin, semi-gloss, gloss. We're going to talk in a minute here about polishing. And really, you do not have to buy gloss to get a gloss surface. So we'll get to that.
Yeah, in that way.
A lot of them are, yes, yeah. So you've got Danish oil, Seal, Armor Seal, water locks, Dale Winburn, he's got his own one that he mixes up himself. They all fall in that category of wipe on, wipe off kind of finishes. And on your handout, I think I've got one of them, you've got Dale's recipe. I think. Yeah. No. Yes. Okay. So, yeah. So you have Dale's. Pardon me?
When you're wiping it on certain wood, like white oak, red oak, and ash, penetrate into the grain. It's very large, open grain. And what I do is after I wipe it, it looks like it's clean. I go over to the air hose and I put it through the skin grain. And you'll be surprised how much comes out. And I'll wipe it probably for 4 to 6 hours every hour to around knots and rain. Come out and the counting spot. So
And that's called weeping. So open pored wood will weep.
sure,
Okay.
maple, not so bad.
Yeah.
But,
Then the next category of finishes are ones that are surface finishes. So these will build your top coat. Okay, like for like a dining room table, for example, or if you want a real high gloss type of finish, you need to build a top coat that's thick enough that'll let you polish that surface. Right. Things like shellac. So here's shellac. You either get spray on or liquid. You ever want to see, you should go to YouTube and watch some YouTube videos on how they make shellac. It's really fascinating. It's from the lac bug, secretions from the lac bug that they boil up and they spread out and they let it dry and harden and they crack it all up. So you see these guys up in these trees and knocking on the tree, getting all this stuff falling down. It's really fascinating how this is made. So this is a natural finish, same with lacquer. Lacquer is a natural finish. And then you get into synthetic finishes, like this is a polyacrylic. This is like a polyurethane finish. Now, when I say natural finish, and this is a synthetic finish, One of the differences is that a natural finish is reversible. Okay, so things like shellac, lacquer, you can remove 100 years later, you can remove with lacquer thinner or denatured alcohol, because shellac's made with denatured alcohol. You can take those solvents and wipe off the finish because there's no chemical reaction that occurs. But if you use a synthetic finish, like a urethane, polyurethane, things like that, as it cures, there's a chemical reaction and it hardens, and the only way to get it off is to sand it off or strip it, I guess, with chemicals. So depending what you're gonna, in the future, a lot of people prefer one type of finish versus the other because how they think it might be used, but will this need to be repaired in the future? For example, people building period style furniture will use shellac, for example, because that was the period that was finish was used. Same thing with glue. As an aside, hide glue, for example, is a natural type of glue, no chemical reaction. So hide glue is reversible. That's why wooden instruments are made out of hide glue. You can take them apart and repair them. But PVA glue, your yellow carpenter glue, once it dries, it's dry. It's harder than the wood grain. So, okay. That's called a, that's,
I don't know what it is.
no, it's no, it's what's it called? Oh, shoot. It's actually done with shellac. Yes, and it's shellac and a little cotton ball. They take cotton ball and wrap it in cheesecloth, tie it all up, dip it in, and it's buffed. It's French polish. So French polish is piano. Right. I usually use a spray-on lacquer type finish if I was doing something like that. Yeah, but it depends. If I was doing a table out of oak for a rustic rural dining room table, I'd use an oil, probably an oil based or a seal-a-cell type of finish. If I'm doing a French polish, you use shellac or a urethane. Sherwin-Williams makes some very nice finishes. My shop, I have a spray booth when it's not filled with junk, but it's not certified for lacquer. But I have to use oil-based finishes, and Sherwin-Williams has a product called Chem Aqua, KEM space AQUA. It's a water-based lacquer, basically. Sprays just like lacquer. Dries hard as a rock. I mean, I have trouble scuffing it between coats. It's so hard. No, well, that's a good point. I mean, no, lacquer does, yes. So a natural based product, lacquer, shellac, you put a coat in, people say I got to scuff between coats. With a natural base finish, you do not have to scuff between coats because the second coat will burn into the first coat and grip. Okay. The only reason you would sand between coats is to remove dust and blemishes, things like that. Synthetic finishes, they cure, and I said there's a chemical reaction, so the second coat won't bind to the first coat. Okay, it's a separate coat. So you sand it to get rid of dust and stuff, but you're also scratching the surface for that second coat to burn to attach to the previous coat. So yeah, so it's a synthetic finish, but it is hard. I'll tell you that. KEM space AQUA, Aqua, water-based finish. Other people think people didn't like water-based finishes because they dry crystal clear. Right? So an oil base, any of these oil-based finishes, you put them on, give you that little amber, warm tone, which a lot of people like. Water-based finishes traditionally dry clear. It almost didn't look like there's a finish on it. You could see a little sheen, but not any kind of color. There are some water-based finishes now that do give you that little warm. There's one called Enduro Bar. It's by General Finishes. That will give you that little warm tone. Okay. Then, so that's surface finishes, CA glue, high performance. This one, high performance is a water-based lacquer, basically. So this has all the same properties as lacquer, but it is a synthetic water-based finish, clear, and dries clear. CA glue for pens, things like that. Friction finishes. Okay, so for turning, there's a number of different brands. Mylan's is just one. It's typically like a shellac, wax kind of finish. Builds a high friction. It requires heat to sort of bind and creates a very gloss surface. Doctor's the Pens Plus is somewhere here. Here's my nice clean bottle of Pens Plus from Doctor's Wood Shop. This is a shellac, walnut oil, and wax mix. Okay, so that's one of the other things they're doing is mixing those now. This walrus oil is a mix of oil and wax. They have one called a furniture wax, and that's I think on my list here, maybe, yeah. Renaissance wax, so you can do a wax finish. Now, I'm not a big fan of wax finishes. I don't think they give a lot of protection, and they get dirty. So you got to strip it off with mineral spirits and put a new one on.
Finish it with wrapping, just he takes the beeswax, just furnish it in and take the oil soap with.
Yep.
Put lipstick on. Yeah, put an old hard spot and furnish it down.
Oh yeah.
The waxing it, but just eliminate a little surface pores. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, it does give you some protection. Yes, you watch some of these old timers, if you will. You know, you got your mason jar with your rag in there. It probably doesn't go on fire because it's closed, but they'll use the same rag for 50 years. Okay. Polishes. So we got this issue called sheen. Okay. So the manufacturers will sell you different products. So like satin, semi-gloss, gloss. And how do they create those different sheens? Basically, they put, well, some of them, for example, will put silica sand basically into it to dull it down. So it gives you a duller sheen. So if you take your can of Deft and you shake it up and you hear that little rattle in there, that's shaking up the stuff they put in there to distribute it. So when you spray it out, it gets distributed evenly. But if you take a glass can of that, it doesn't rattle because there's nothing in it to rattle. There's no sand or anything in there to rattle. But you can create a various sheens by how you polish the surface. Okay, so you don't necessarily have to buy satin, semi-gloss, or gloss surface. So a hand rubbed finish, meaning like basically with some of these oils, the penetrating oil, gives you that matte hand rubbed type of finish. Okay, but if you have a finish that's going to build a top coat, like a lacquer or a polyurethane or urethane finish, you can polish that surface to get different sheens. What I use are these type pads. These are Abralon pads, Merca company. These are right. So these pads I use mainly. The best place to buy them are from the companies that sell products for bowling balls. These are what polishes bowling balls, right? And what you can do, they're a little grid surface, hook and loop back, and you spray some soapy water on your surface after it's cured. And use this on your orbital sander or your polisher or whatever, and do the surface with this, okay? And if you use a 500 grit, you'll get a matte surface. You use 1,000 grit, you'll get a satin finish. Use a 2,000 grit, you'll get a semi-gloss. Use a 4,000 grit, you'll get a gloss finish. Now, in the old days, people used rotten stone and pumice. Say, well, why not just do that? Well, the problem with using those is you got to hand do them, hand rub them. And if you rub a little more here, and if you rub a little more here, you get these uneven surfaces. Yeah. You use these, you're sanding basically. You're getting a nice uniform pattern over your whole surface, right? So you can use it and you can get a mirror finish with 4,000 grit. I mean, you can take a board like this, start at 500, and as you're going up the grit, you can see your overhead lights in your surface. And first you won't see them, then you'll see a vague, and by the time you get done, it's like a mirror, okay? You don't like it, go back down. So you can control what your sheen looks like, okay, using these. And then,
That's the, I used to say wouldn't for all my finishes.
Yep.
So that's exactly what I do. It's all one that's not too shiny and slick. I just stack 5 up.
right,
If they want super gloss, I go all the way to 4,000 with sand.
4,000? Right.
Where I stop on sand.
And then after your 4,000, right. So how do you get rid of all those little swirls and stuff? Automobile finish, polish, right? So here's McGuire's professional car wax. You can get car cleaner and stuff as well. But this will remove those swirls and you'll get just a mirror, clean mirror surface when you're done, if that's what you want. But one people don't like it. It's very hard to maintain. It's hard to, you know, do. Oh yeah. Yeah. Okay, buffing. Well, you can buff, right? So you can get everybody's mentioned last time. You'll mention the Beal buffing system, right? Well, that's what these pads are from the Beal buffer. You can get. Peter's got one there. It's on a mandrel, and there's diamond and wax, right? So you can also get this mandrel so that they screw. So this you know, all your pads just have a thing, and this goes into your Morse taper, and you just put these on and screw them on. So it's whatever you know want to do. So. Oh yeah. Oh. Okay. If you buy a new one, when you turn on the lathe, make sure you're not standing behind it because you'll be covered with lint from everything flying out of these guys.
I think about that.
Right. Yeah. Do you have a ball? So you can also get them as a ball like this. And I should have said, where is the ball? Where is the ball? So yeah, so you can get them like this. And this one, I guess you could actually put in your drill. You've got the on here. But so I use this all the time on our mallet handles, for example. Couple, at least I have observed, if I'm doing something like walnut, I will not use white diamond on a dark wood because that white stuff will get into the pores and bear to get out. So I'll skip the white diamond. But you got to be careful. When you use these pads or this, make sure you've got enough coats of your finish on that you're not going to go through the finish. Okay? You're going to sand between coats. I will start out with 320, which is why I'll use this type of pad on to sand between coats. soft back. I don't want, I'll do C320 or 400. I even have some 600 here that I'll use between coats because I don't want to ruin the surface. I'm just trying to get rid of little dust and things like that. If you're sanding something flat, hold the paper like this so you don't hit the edges as you're sanding and take off the stain on the edge. But yeah.
Well, it's one thing, once the day soil dries, 24 hours, I use it every week. That's why I say it.
Oh, right.
I use it before I put the soil on, and you're active running in the wood, the red, which is 3 or 4 months there, the gray is 8 to 9, and sand, valve, and white. Put all that, all it one way, stop it, burning, I'll run it up to max, and then after the day for everything dries, I probably want to do it up. But I very rarely use now because I can use it about
Yeah. Yeah. On the staple page, I mentioned the 3M sanding sheets. So those, they do, Peter Stark have them for sale right here. Okay, I think I'm almost done. Paste wax. So buff, we use a BO buffer, paste wax. So there's 2 types of wax. There is carnauba wax, looks like this. And then there is microcrystalline wax, which we can have some this isn't good. So microcrystalline wax. Okay, so to see the color difference. Okay, well, so what's the difference between these 2 waxes? So carnauba wax, again, is a natural natural wax. It's a very hard wax. It is because it's a natural product, the molecules are all sort of random. Okay, so when you use it, you get a very hard, durable surface. But because the molecules are all sort of random, the reflection is sort of scattered as it comes off the surface. Okay. Microcrystalline wax is a synthetic wax, man-made. All the molecules are all lined up. It's like a brick wall. Okay. It's not quite as durable, not quite as hard as this, but it's clearer. So the light reflecting off your surface gives you a clearer surface than carnauba wax. Whether you can see it or not, I don't know. But that, from the scientific perspective, that's one of the main differences between these waxes.
Renaissance wax developed for primarily museums and stuff to polish wood, metal, everything.
Because you don't get fingerprints. Right. So if you polish something and you're worried about a show and you have people pick it up with fingerprints, use some Renaissance wax or the Dr. Woodwork. Right. Yeah. Now he mixes his, it says walnut oil, so it's not a pure microcrystalline wax like Renaissance wax is a pure microcrystalline wax. And also, I was going to say, it's also very expensive, but it lasts forever. Beeswax. Yep, there is beeswax. It's a softer wax. Yeah. Let's see, in my notes, as I said, everything's food safe once it cures. Using a well-ventilated area. Okay, and finally, when you're going to put a finish on your piece, or you're going to color your piece and then put a finish on it, practice on something else. Okay, if you're going to, sand a piece of walnut or maple to 400 grit, sand a piece of scrap to 400 grit, and try your color on it, try your top coat on it and see what happens. Don't practice on your good piece. Can't tell you the number of times I've had a student in my class say, I tell them any questions open, and then one will say, I built this, little bookcase and I stained it like this and it just didn't look good. I said, well, what did your practice piece look like? I get this deer in the headlights look. Right. So always practice on something else, so that and have that other piece sanded, prepped the same way as what your final piece is going to be. This doesn't help you to sand this to 180 and this to 220 and then see what it looks like. So, oh, absolutely.
Try them all.
Yep.
And say which one do I like the best.
Yeah, takes
Just use one board and just use like
Right.
each strip.
just like I did here. Here are 3 different. Take a board like this, put some carpenter tape across here, put one color dye here, another tie here, another tie here, and see what it looks like, right? Or so yes. When doesn't apply here, but when you build a piece of furniture, cut your board oversized so that you always have a piece that's bigger that you can then cut up at the end, use it to set up your table saw for your joinery, say, but you also have wood to practice finish. So, okay, any questions? I think. Oh, Sammy, oh, yeah. Oh, yes. But I mean, yes, yes, milk paint is they may have made it with milk years ago. I don't know, but it's a nice paint. It gives you a nice matte surface, and I've used some milk paint before. It's nice.
It's a secret to maintain the red color.
Keep it in a room with no windows. Use a high UV finish, but they'll delay it. I don't think anything's going to protect it. I mean, actually, I don't have one here, but General Finishes does make a high UV finish. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Oh, right. I forgot to mention sealers. Okay, there's sealers. There's some people call them sanding sealers. Others people call them pre-color sealers, blotch control. I didn't even mention that. So what that is that when you have a piece of wood, some wood has more dense and less dense areas. Okay, so if you take a piece of oak, for example, walnut, it is uniformly dense across its surface, and it'll take color or finish uniformly. Then you've got woods that have various densities, like pine, poplar, cherry. Okay, so when you put a finish on that, you'll see the softer areas soak in more finish than the other areas. Okay, so what happens is, especially with the color, it's going to soak in more color in the softer areas than the other areas. But even with a clear finish, like with an oil finish, it'll soak in at different rates, and it'll look blotchy. Okay, curl in a wood is a blotch, but it's a fancy blotch. But cherry is notorious for blotching. It looks crappy when you have that. So how do you not have blotching? So manufacturers will sell what's called a pre-color or blotch control. And there is a sanding sealer as well, where you put it on, you rub it in, and then you sand it, rub some more in, and that actually helps fill the pores of the wood if you want to fill the pores of the wood. what these do is they supposedly will create a surface that will absorb the color or the finish more uniformly. Okay. Some people will use diluted shellac, like a half-pound cut or something like that. I wouldn't use a spray shellac. Yeah, shellac is a very good sealer. Zinsser, all these primers you see in the store, all have shellac in them. But so some people use that, and then the other manufacturers do it. The problem with some of those are that they seal the wood. Well, therefore it doesn't absorb as much color, right? If you use too much shellac, it's not going to absorb much color and you're not going to get it. But Charles Neal has a product called Charles Neal's pre-color conditioner. All right. It is amazing stuff. It really is. Not only does it give you a nice uniform surface to color, color will be nice and uniform. If it has curl in it, you still get a majority or a lot of that curl. So it's amazing stuff. Now, the problem is Neil died, about 3 years ago, right? So I don't think Devin, his grandson, is selling it anymore. I've tried to call him and stuff. So if you have some and you want to try it, give me a call. Because there's a few people that know the formula. So I know the formula. But it's so if you're going to use like cherry and you're worrying about blotch, you want to use a sealer. All right. Thank you.